Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine. Welcome to this video series where we are exploring child development, primarily using the resource by Bernard Lievegoed and Phases of Childhood Growing in Mind, Body, and Spirit. But I actually am referring to other resources as well, and you can find the complete list of resources on the blog post that accompanies this video, and you can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. So we're going to start out by looking at these grand 7-year cycles. Now, looking at child development through 7-year cycles is not a novel idea. It's actually rather ancient. Some of the things that you might not be familiar with as far as the terminology that I think is a little bit more unique to the Waldorf pedagogy is using terms such as will forces, feeling forces, and thinking forces, or rather the willing, feeling, and thinking stages of development, which are the 0 to 7 age range, which is primarily dominated by the will forces. And this is an age of imitation, followed by 7 to 14 and the stage of feeling. And in this stage, children primarily learn through a loving authority, through living examples and imagery. And then from 14 to 21, you have the thinking phase. And at this point, adolescents learn from specialty instructors who have authority, but now the authority is being questioned a little bit. They're exploring the what of life, the how of life, the why of life, and just before they graduate, the who of life. Followed by the 18-year Rubicon, where adolescents or young adults are looking to step out into the world. So today we're going to look at these 7-year cycles and the Rubicons within each cycle. So I mentioned the 18-year Rubicon. Rubicon is used just to describe this milestone within these 7-year cycles. And each of these 7-year cycles has 2 Rubicons coming at around 2 1/3 year, to divide this 7-year cycle into 3 stages, or 3 phases rather. In that first 7-year cycle, in the willing stage of development, you have in that first 2 1/3 years, the willing stage of development. I also have a chart that goes along with this, and I highly encourage you to check that out and then listen to this description, because it can get a little bit confusing with all of these different intermediary phases within these stages, and there's still more to come. So this first stage of development, 0 to 7, is marked by a willing phase from 0 to about 2 1/3, followed by a feeling willing phase from about 2 1/3 to 4 2/3, followed by a thinking willing phase from about 4 2/3 to about 7 years. Now, these year markers are general. They're not a hard and fast rule. Development is quite fluid, and so you might see that your children or students achieve these developmental milestones maybe 6 months to a year before or after their peers, and that's fairly normal in general. So let's talk about that first milestone Rubicon in the first 7-year cycle, this willing stage of development. In the willing stage of development, and actually let's define what that actually looks like. A willing stage where the willing forces are dominant is a time when children learn primarily through doing. Their will forces are very strong. And you could imagine these little babies, and even all the way through toddlerhood, where there's just movement. Babies and toddlers and young children need to experience the world through movement and touching things and climbing things and digging things and exploring things and breaking things. And this is primarily how they are discovering the world around them. It's very movement based. So the will forces are predominant during this stage of development. However, they are still present in all stages of development and into adulthood. But this is the time when they especially dominate, and you can see that in the learning of young children. So in this first phase of this first 7-year stage, you have a willing phase. Now this willing phase is marked by, if you can imagine that little infant who is just wiggling around nonstop. They're not still unless they're sleeping, and even then they might still turn over now and again, but they are just constantly in motion. They are trying to learn how to control their bodies. They're trying to lift their head, control these arms and their limbs, things that at first seem chaotic, and then they very quickly master the control over their limbs. So you can imagine that first 2 years where there is such activity during already this willing phase of development. But there's one more stage that is a part of this first 2.5 years, or 2 1/3 years, and that is the thinking development. So we have development of thinking, feeling, and willing in the first 7 years, during a time when you have your willing, feeling, and thinking phase within your willing stage. So there's a lot going on, but there's something pretty curious. The beginning and at the end, or in that first 2 1/3 year and that last 2 1/3 year, you have a willing and thinking that express both a psychological and a physiological development. And in the center, you have a double dose of feeling. You have a feeling development, and you also have this feeling phase within this grand stage, or stage of development. So what is happening during this feeling phase, during a development of feeling in the willing stage of development? At around between 2 and 3, something pretty profound is happening. Actually, probably the most profound developmental milestone is happening when almost all of us don't even remember, and that is the development of the eye. Prior to this point, babies did not have an awakening of the eye. They were one with their primary caregiver, and even at birth, there wasn't even an understanding of the boundaries of their own physical body. As you touch the baby or the toddler, they begin to know the extremities of their own being. Prior to that, they don't even know yet. So as they learn where the physical body of theirs is separate from their primary caregiver, and we know that when babies are very young, there's no concept of time, and there's no concept of you versus me. There just isn't that yet. But at around 2.5 or so, you see that first awakening, and it is very profound, and it is marked right around the time of the feeling phase of this willing stage of development and during the feeling development of this stage. The feeling development usually is in the center part of each of these different developmental stages, or rather the feeling phase is at the center of each of these developmental phases. And it turns out that at the feeling phase, where it coordinates with either the feeling development or the feeling metamorphosis or the feeling synthesis, you have some of the greatest developmental milestones. The most profound for the individual happens during those double feeling phases of development. So this new toddler who has just discovered that they are an I separate from everyone else, and that they no longer refer to themselves in the third person, now is expressing a lot more feelings and a unique autonomy, which everyone who has toddlers has heard of the terrible twos. Some people refer to it as the terrific twos. Either way, it's a time where young toddlers are still working through this stage of development through their will forces. So they are touching and climbing and exploring through action. They have just discovered they are an I, and they're in their feeling phase and their feeling development of this time period. So you might have an increase in tantrums or meltdowns, the immersion of the word no, which soon turns into more agreeable language as the child becomes 3.5 and 4 years old. So this particular middle point in this stage can be a little bit challenging. But after all, this child, up until that point, had a lot to learn. They were primarily developing their speech, standing, being upright, their thinking. All of this had to be developed in that first 2 and 1/3 years. So while they were in their willing phase of development between birth and about 2 and 1/3 years, they were also in their thinking development, which meant that their brains were going through so much cognitive development because they're coming into this world, taking in all of their senses, their experiences, and they're having to process all of this. Now, little children are just sponges to the world. They haven't established a mature self yet, and so everything that's coming in, they're just absorbing it. There aren't really any filters. Once they turn 7, they begin to establish a more profound self, which means that there are ways to bring in that information rather than just letting them absorb everything through their senses. So it's a little bit different once they hit 7, but as babies, there's just this whole world that's just coming in to meet them. They're not discerning what to bring in and what to leave out. It is all just being absorbed into them. So between 0 and 2 and 1/3, their thinking has really developed because they need to learn how to talk and walk and think. And when we look at the physical aspects of the child or the baby or the student, we can see that there are physical attributes that when they develop, they express an inner psychological development. So when we look at a baby, predominantly they look like mostly head. They are not as well defined in their limbs. Babies tend to be 1-to-4 ratio from head to body, and their spines tend to be a little bit straight. They haven't quite gotten that curvature that we're going to see a little bit later on. They cannot extend their limbs above or around their head. So being able to lift your hand or go around your head, that's actually a developmental indication that children have or are grown and are ready for school. Up until that point, as toddlers and young children and babies, their heads are larger in proportion to the rest of their body, as opposed to older children and adults. Now, it's worth noting that while the baby is mostly head when they are little in proportion, their heads do continue to grow. However, it's as if the rest of the body needs to grow down from the head, just because the head is just so much more established than the rest of the body. Let's move into the last third of this developmental stage of the willing forces, where the willing forces predominate. When the child is between about 5 years and 7 years, they are in their thinking phase of their willing stage of development at a time when their willing is being developed. So they had a thinking development between 0 and 2, and now they're having a willing development. Now that development is expressed in the lengthening of the limbs. So anytime you have a lengthening of the limbs in a growth spurt, it generally indicates a development, a metamorphosis, or a synthesis in the will forces. And whenever there is a broadening or a growth in breadth in the trunk area. It generally coincides with a feeling development that coincides with the heart, the rhythmic system, and the lungs. And whenever there is a change in the head, we can imagine that there is a cognitive development that is happening. So we can see that starting at around 5, 6, or 7 years old, children may begin to lose their first tooth. And this indicates that there is a development that is happening in the thinking, in the head. Now, between 5 and 7, or at around 5 rather, there's another Rubicon, and this is another developmental milestone. So we had the about 3-year-old milestone where a child developed their eye. And then at 5, they have another developmental milestone where children now have a shift in how they relate to other children and how they play and how they engage in shared imaginative play. Prior to about age 5, younger children, maybe 3, 4-year-olds, up until almost 5-year-olds, they would enjoy play that in some ways looks like parallel play. This looks like when you go to the park with your children and they are maybe 2, 3, or 4 years old, and they all have, like, say, a little truck that they're playing with, and they might be playing next to each other. They might want each other's toys, but they're not having a shared experience. It might look like they're playing together, but they're not having a shared imaginative experience. This kind of parallel play continues until about that 5-year-old developmental transition. The other thing that you will notice between the 4-year-old and the 5-year-old is the type of stories that they will enjoy. The type of stories that a 4-year-old will especially enjoy generally are narrative stories in which their own life is being narrated back to them. This might look like an evening bedtime story where the parent is telling the child about what they did that day, what they had for breakfast, what kind of clothing they wore, what they had for lunch, where they went to play, who they saw. Children that age especially love those kinds of stories. They're not quite ready for stories with developed plots or even stories that have some tension. However, at around 5, there is a remarkable change that occurs. There is a development in the type of play and the type of stories that children will enjoy. And this is generally a time at around 5 when children are leaving the safety and the comfort of their home for their first engagements with other students in either kindergarten or a play school or a play group. And it's really important that children have that opportunity to play with other children so that they may engage in that kind of imaginative shared experiences or just play with other children that is not directed by adults or older children. So if you have a 2, 3, or 4-year-old and you're thinking, but my child does these shared imaginative experiences, or they're not really doing parallel play, they're actually doing cooperative play, it might be cooperative play that is instructed or engaged by an older student or by a parent. So let's imagine this. You have a 5 or a 6-year-old or maybe a 7-year-old and they want to play house. And so they assign, you're the mommy, you're the daddy, and you're the baby. Now, if a 3-year-old is playing with them, they might be assigned a role and therefore they will participate, but it wasn't initiated by the child. At around 5, then children have that developmental milestone where they initiate that play on their own. And usually that play gets very creative and quite imaginative. And this is a time when we want to have a lot of open-ended activities for our children so they may process the information that they are learning either through experience or storytelling through their imaginative play. So things like blocks and fabrics and other open-ended toys, and the space and the time to do that is really important for their development. So it might look like you telling your 5-year-old a story. It might be imaginative. It might include some tension. And then the child then recreates that story through action on their own, either with other children or by themselves. And this is a very important processing activity that children between 5 and 7 do pretty often, pretty naturally. And this is why we don't necessarily want to include or engage children in academic rigor prior to that 7-year change, because the work that they're doing between 5 and 7 is really important for their thinking later on. So movement-based activities help the thinking capacity in adolescence. So doing activities that require thinking or sitting still or using your will forces, which are active at that age for gross motor skills. If you're using them in fine motor skill development, like handwriting, for instance, you might not fulfill their full capacity in other activities later on and in their thinking capacities post-puberty and into adolescence. But what about those will forces? They're still quite active. You can see with the lengthening of the limbs of the 5 to 7-year-old that they are adopting that child look. There's now differentiation between the chest and the waist. There's actually more of a defined waist. You start to see that S curve in their spine, and their faces are slowly beginning to change as a marker for that internal mental or cognitive change that is right upon them. So at around 7, we usually mark this with the loss of teeth, because that is one of the most significant and obvious physical markers that of course occurs in the head that indicates that a mental process has occurred or is occurring. Other things, the facial structure begins to change. The whole body begins to extend and lengthen. When children were babies, there wasn't much of a neck, and there wasn't even much of a nose either, and the limbs were usually rounded. The whole body was fairly rounded. By the time the child is entering school, their limbs have extended, their muscles have developed, and you can actually see muscle definition, whereas before you would not be able to see that. And you can see an overall determination. Their stride seems more confident and purposeful. And these are indications, not just the loss of teeth, but these are other physical indications that the child has completed the majority of their growth for that time period, and those life forces that were so busy at work building this child's body are now freed for other work. And that other work is finally the academic work that so many of us are anxious to get to. At around 7 is a remarkable time where children are finally ready for academic instruction from a loving authority. Teachers have and parents have a few years before those students and children begin to question authority and begin to sort of move away from you as a teacher and as an authority figure. In grade 1, a lot of times students sort of inch their way closer to their teacher, wanting to have closer proximity to them. The aspects of education and how this developmental unfolding affects education is not necessarily spoken about in these first couple of chapters of phases of childhood growing in body, soul, and spirit. And so I'm bringing in some other resources specifically to talk about how academics might be worked in with the development of the child briefly. We're not going to go into too much when it comes to the education for the child between 7 and 14. But it is important to see how the child's development coincides perfectly with certain aspects of an educational model. So at around 7, when the child is now ready for first grade and that academic learning where they're really revering their teacher, oftentimes they will listen to their teachers more than their parents, and they will think, well, my teacher said this or my teacher said that. It's really important because that teacher represents a loving authority. It's really important that it's a loving authority, and this will will play a role later on in the child's development, in specifically their spiritual development. So if you are a religious family, it's especially even more important that that authority that the child has in those younger years is a loving authority, because this is their first interaction with what it means to have, or what kind of creator or God that child will imagine as they grow older. They're not maybe as consciously aware of this now, and also because of their general sanguine nature in childhood, they move through feelings and experiences very quickly, or I should say more quickly than they do in adolescence. And so even if they have a difficult situation, they're moving through it fairly quickly, versus a difficult situation, especially an emotional situation in adolescence, tends to take much longer to resolve. So it's especially important for that 7-year-old and throughout those early years of academic education that they are with a loving authority. During that first couple of years of this next 7-year cycle, the child is in their willing phase of their feeling stage, going through a thinking metamorphosis. So there's a lot going on in that first couple of years. We also have to remember that this student is still in a phase of development where they are one with the world. There is no concept of time. They are in an age of absolute innocence, and they believe in the fantastical without question. So when you tell them a story about, say, a unicorn, for instance, they will believe it without question. Versus if you tell an 11-year-old a story about a unicorn, they will question you because they haven't had that experience in life and they've associated that with something that is not real. So if you tell them that there are unicorns, they're not going to believe you. But if you tell a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old that unicorns exist, they will believe you without a doubt. So a lot of times, fantastical stories are used in early academics in the Waldorf pedagogy for a couple of reasons. One is that the children believe these stories without question, which allows the deeper truths and lessons and meanings of the stories to come through very profoundly, very deeply, and really touches those students, because they are not held up by the fantastical elements of the story that just simply cannot happen when you use logic and reason and adulthood to interpret those stories. A very simple example would be using Little Red Riding Hood, for instance. When the grandmother gets swallowed by the wolf, one might think that's a horrific story, but the child is not absorbing or digesting that story that way. For them, they can see the greater truths and meanings in those stories, which on the surface may have one meaning, and as the child grows, deeper meanings unfold over time. And that is the beauty of these living lessons, is that you have these stories that hopefully you don't give lessons and conclusions to, that can stay living for the student the same way experiences and phenomena and observations lead to conclusions and concepts later. That same mode of learning is revisited often and again in the elementary and even in the high school years. What this looks like is that when you have a set of facts, you might draw a conclusion. When you observe natural phenomena, you may arrive at some concept. Those concepts can grow, change, adapt, and even over time, they might morph into new concepts. But if you begin with the concept, that becomes rigid and fixed and somewhat limiting. So when you start with something that's open-ended and a living lesson, you allow that lesson to transform itself because the student has transformed herself. So as the student grows and develops and learns and experiences, those living stories that stay with them throughout the years will transform themselves into new lessons as the child reflects on those stories. And it is the same with all the lessons, but it is especially story-driven in those first few years of academic instruction. We can see a thinking metamorphosis during these first couple of years of the feeling phase or the feeling stage of development. There's also the willing phase during the first couple of years. So you have a willing component and you have a thinking component. So the willing component means that these students still have a necessity for movement-based learning and action. So you might include a lot of movement math when you're teaching them the quality of numbers. You might include whole body learning for form drawing or for the letters of the alphabet, because those students still need whole body learning, and it's another reason why handwork is so important in those early years, and of course throughout all of the years of learning into high school. But we start with knitting in grade 1, which really helps that brain develop through the cross-body action of knitting, where you are taking your yarn in one hand and wrapping it around the knitting needle in the other hand, and that cross-body action right across the heart is really good for their brain development. So you have this thinking metamorphosis that happens in this first couple of years, and we can see this because now the student is able to have the capacity for academic learning, because those etheric forces, those life forces that had been so busy in the prior 7 years for literally the formation of the body, the formation of that from the baby into the school-aged child, are finally freed for other work. And that other work includes the academic rigor, it includes establishing rhythms and habits, and of course it's used for memory. We're right upon the next tremendous milestone that a child will go through, and it is called the 9-year change. The 9-year change coincides with the feeling phase in the feeling stage of development during a metamorphosis of feelings. So you can imagine this tremendous time when a child is going through not just a psychological development in their feelings, but also a physical development as well. You will see that their trunk expands and lengthens at this time, and they grow more in breadth before their next growth spurt in the limbs. They are no longer a part of the world in the same way. They are now recognizing that they are an entity separate from the world. This is a time when they finally experience time. They did not experience time the same way before. It would look something like this. When I was about 7 years old, I thought that the school year was a year long and that summer vacation was also a year long. The days just spread out in front of you to eternity. You lived in complete innocence. You did not have a concept of the past, and so everything that happened in the past was referred to as, like, say, yesterday, but it could be literally yesterday, it could be earlier that day, or it could be a year ago, but whatever it was just considered yesterday. Post 9-year change, there is an understanding of time. It's a time when the curriculum teaches grammar. It hasn't been taught before. And if you're in music lessons, it's a time where music prior to the 9-year change is taught through listening and copying and repeating. And now you can actually read sheet music. And lastly, and probably most profoundly, it's a time where Children no longer believe in fantasy or imagination just because they are told that something exists. They now begin to question whether, for instance, the tooth fairy is real. And when they realize that the tooth fairy is not real, it can be a sad, grieving experience for the child. Now, grief, sadness, depression, anxiety, nightmares, conflicts, heightened emotions are all part of that 9-year change. If you're noticing these qualities and traits in your child where they didn't exist before, it is likely, and it's around 9, 8, 9, 10, around that age range, it's likely part of the 9-year change. It can be really disruptive. It's challenging, it's scary, and I've noticed that it's a time when students want to write their story. They want to write a story, or they want to write their story, or they just want to write a book. And I found this to be a really curious time for students to do this at a time when they are awakening to the world. So this is the second of 3 either awakenings or separations or intense milestones, developmental milestones. I like to call it at 3, the awakening to the self, and at 9, the awakening to the world, and at 16, awakening to God. But those are some of the terminologies that I've sort of taken based on the terminology that's used to describe each of these developmental stages. If we fast forward to around 11, we'll see the next Rubicon in this feeling stage of development. Once the child has overcome the challenges of the 9-year change and even had a year where things started to settle down a little bit, sometime after that golden year of childhood, which generally is around 5th grade, where the limbs haven't quite had their growth spurt yet. And so they're in this really beautiful equilibrium. They are still coordinated before they become uncoordinated with their growth spurt. They've managed the emotional challenges of the 9-year change, and they've sort of adapted to, I am part of this world. So that golden age is a little bit short-lived, because after around 11 3/4, or 11 2/3 rather, we have the next Rubicon. And this developmental milestone generally coincides with puberty for a lot of students. And it also coincides with this metamorphosis of the willing, or will forces. This metamorphosis of will forces will be expressed in the lengthening of the limbs. You'll see a growth spurt in the limbs, and the limbs grow from the bottom half first and then the top half. So you can imagine how challenging that might be for a child who just the year before could do all kinds of acrobatic feats and be so agile and confident in their movements. Suddenly they become uncoordinated, and maybe they're even tripping over their own feet as they walk or run. It can be a disconcerting time for them, but their will forces are metamorphosizing at that age as their limbs are extending. You can see determination once again in their actions and in their whole being, which results in a bit of conflict with their authority figures. So at around puberty, you're going to see questioning of authority that could be for teachers or for parents. And that can be a very challenging time as these young adolescents are starting to wonder what is fair, what is just, who has authority. And that comes out in around the 11 3/4 age range until about 14. That's especially a time when the first challenge of authority begins. It will continue in adolescence at different pockets of time. This thinking phase in their feeling stage of development marks an important milestone in their education. This is a time where students understand cause and effect and consequences, and they are introduced to the non-living sciences of mineralogy, astronomy, physics, chemistry, and anatomy. Physiology is taught within there, but anatomy, when it deals with the bones, is actually generally introduced after chemistry. This is a time where students' thinking is blossoming. They're in the beginning stages of their thinking, their cognitive awakening. It's a thinking metamorphosis, and so they're able to comprehend things like history, like a timeline of history, whereas before, history might have been ancient civilizations, but time periods weren't really part of the lessons. They certainly, even as adults trying to understand things that happened 3000 BC can seem disconnected in some way. But by 6th grade, when history with time periods are taught, is at a time when those time periods actually have relevance to modern life. So we're doing like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Middle Ages, and then into the Renaissance and modern times. And so those time periods have relevance, and learning those dates makes sense for the student that age. Mathematics takes a transformation as well, and even art takes on a transformation. Whereas students might have done wet on wet watercoloring in grade 1, they experience veil painting, which is watercoloring on dry paper, and they experience black and white drawing with charcoal and perspective drawing, which is really important for the middle school aged child or student, because they are starting to take on or learn about other perspectives. That development occurs in middle school, and so even the art is reflective of that developmental milestone. In all of the feeling stage of development, the lessons were image-based, living stories, had an artistic element, and met the child with feeling. This was indicative of this entire 7-year cycle, which is really important for the student between grade 1 and grade 8. With the beginning of high school and the 14-year-old student, you have the birth of the astral body, and you have this amazing cognitive development for this thinking stage of development. At the beginning of the thinking stage of development, you have a willing phase and a thinking synthesis. So you have a thinking synthesis with a willing phase in a thinking stage of development. So there's a lot going on in this initial part of this stage of development. You're going to see that with this cognitive development, you're going to see changes in the face once again. You're going to see the first physical differentiation between girls and boys more profoundly at this stage. So while sexual maturity was gained at puberty, the physical changes that really show great differentiation between boys and girls, and truly great differentiation between a child, like a girl and a woman, or a boy and a man, really occur in the adolescent years, especially high school and college, where you can see for boys the development of the larynx and facial hair, and for girls a change in the structure of their body, so their pelvises are become larger, whereas in boys their shoulders become larger. But in their head specifically, you see the jaw expand for boys and you see the forehead expand for girls, or rather you should see that there is more of a triangle shape in the facial structure for boys and an inverted triangle shape in the facial structure for girls. And you start to see that during that thinking the thinking synthesis at around 14 to 16. You really begin to see those facial changes, as much as you're going to continue to see the development of the entire body. However, it's maybe more around 15 or 16 that you see potentially more profound changes. Certainly these are fluid times, and so it could be a little bit earlier and it could be a little bit later. But around 16, you see that third growth in breadth. So that is a widening and a lengthening of the torso or the trunk. And later you'll see a bit more of development of the limbs. Maybe not so much a growth spurt so much at 18, but if there was going to be one last growth spurt in height, it will be around 17, 18, 19. Otherwise, it'll be a little bit more of a development of, say, the bone structure or the muscular structure. So in that first phase, that willing phase during the thinking synthesis, in the thinking stage of development, you see some profound changes in a student's cognitive abilities. This is the time when they can think critically, they can think abstractly and logically and with reason. And this is a time when they really want to engage in that kind of discussion and thought-provoking academics. It's still of value to bring some aspects of living stories, but the things that really drew them into the stories when they were younger may not be the same elements now that their thinking capacities have really blossomed. At around 15 and a third, 15 to 16 years old, you see another milestone, maybe even 16 and a half, you see another really big developmental milestone. This is in the feeling phase of the thinking stage during a feeling synthesis. And this is the third profound milestone that occurs. And I'm calling it the awakening to God, but it's really a spiritual search for truth. And this happens right when those two feeling phases are coinciding with the thinking phase, or thinking stage rather. And this means that children, or rather adolescents, are seeking spiritual truth that can be substantiated rather than the moral or religious or spiritual instruction that students received prior in their younger years, their elementary years, where they accepted what their parents taught them spiritually, religiously, or morally. Now they are questioning those religious teachings, and they are seeking truth with evidence because they're in their thinking stage of development. This spiritual awakening is extremely profound, and for me it's the third of the three awakenings. The awakening to the self at around age 3, the awakening to the world at around age 9, and the awakening to a higher power at around age 16. This is when they're searching for this deeper meaning, these deeper spiritual truths. We finally get to the 18-year Rubicon. This is a time when students likely are leaving their home. Their will forces are being synthesized, and you can really see that with a determination to maybe travel, leave their home, maybe go off to college, or maybe go off to find work. There's this desire to depart, to leave, to explore, and to engage with their will forces for determination and purpose. And you can just see that not just in their entire being, but mentally as well. This is also a time of the thinking phase in the thinking stage of development, which is very appropriate if those same students are going to go off to university or college or any kind of higher education, because they are especially ready for even more rigor in their thinking phase of their thinking stage of development. I hope that you enjoyed this overview of the 7-year cycles. I encourage you to check out the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can see my notes and the charts that can hopefully help you understand this a little bit better. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to learn more about child development in general, you can find me on my website at pepperandpine.com.